Going along with fiscal policy, remember fiscal policy is what the government does to affect the economy, and we have several things: taxation, spending, borrowing, and regulations. Last time we did taxation, this time we're looking at spending, and spending is closely linked to borrowing. The two seem to be intertwined. So we're going to try and keep it looking at the spending this time, but it's going to go over into the borrowing because that's part of it. All right? So remember, our formula for GDP was C plus I plus G plus X minus M, and that is our gross domestic product. Now remember, in that C plus I plus G, that G is the government spending. And so in theory, whatever the government spends money on adds to the GDP. Okay? But what we also learned in that is that the government has to get that money from somewhere. So if the government gets that money through taxes, it comes out of the C and the I and goes down into the G. So it doesn't really add anything additional to your economy. It's simply choosing different trade-offs. You know, it's the opportunity cost of more government spending is going to be less consumption and less investment. So that's just the trade-off we face, all right? So when governments spend money, it does increase GDP, but at the cost of lowering GDP in other sectors of the economy. And this is called the crowding out effect. All right? So we're going to look a lot more at this in class, and I'll put the facts and figures up on the board as far as the spending and the pie charts and the bar graphs and those kind of things. But here we want to just talk about the simple philosophies. If you spend more than you produce, you have debt. All right? So one way that the government gets money is through taxes. The other way that the government can put money into the economy is through debt. Now, most governments like to choose debt because then you don't have the trade-off through taxation. See, you can actually get more GDP because there's all the C, there's all the I, and then the government spending, C plus I plus G, is just bigger in the short term, okay? So if you borrow money, if you spend money into the economy through borrowing, then your GDP absolutely goes up now, okay? However, in the long run, debt requires you to pay it back with interest. So what this means is that you will get a higher standard of living, you will get more GDP now, and in the future, you will get less. Not just because you have to pay back what you borrowed from the future, but you will have to pay back what you borrowed from the future with interest, and so it'll be more than what you borrowed, okay? Imagine if someone came to you and said, would you like to buy a $500 TV for $600? And you'd say, well, no, why would I pay the extra $100? It's worth $500. And they said, well, you don't have $500 now. So if you want the $500 TV now, you can buy it with interest, and you'll pay it back over time plus the interest, and that'll be $600. Now, if you ask most Americans that, they would say no. But if you ask them what they do with their spending, that's absolutely what they do. They buy $500 TVs now for $600. Okay? But they say, but I have to have the TV now. I want it now, and I don't have the money now. And so they borrow it from the future. And so, in a sense, what you're doing is you're taking tomorrow's consumption. You're grabbing hold of tomorrow's resources and you're pulling them into the present. Okay? And by doing that, you can have more now at the cost of having less later. Because you've grabbed hold of resources in the future. That's what debt is, and you've pulled that debt into the present. See, savings is the opposite. With saving, what you've done is you've accumulated money in the past, and now you're going to have more money in the future. Because you saved it, and now you're bringing it into the future. That's past consumption you could have had. You could have spent money in the past, but instead you saved it, and so you've brought the past's money or consumption into the future, and you have more now. So if you save money, you have more in the future. If you borrow money, you have less in the future. It's just a matter of time. And so on the scale of time there, are you pulling savings in, or are you pulling debt backwards to you so you can have more now? All right? So this is the problem with spending. If you spend what you make now, things balance. But if you spend more than what you make, then you're going to have less in the future. Okay? All right. So overspending now results in higher GDP now. Okay? At the price of lower GDP tomorrow. There's no getting around it. This is the reality of the universe. Okay? And we talked about this at the very beginning, and I said there's a lot of people that are not living in reality. All right. The fix to this problem of ever-increasing debts and ever-increasing borrowing from the future to some point at which we can't do that anymore and it'll all crash is to let it crash and return to reality. Now, what has happened is that when we decided to pull a little bit of future into the now, if we'd have let it crash then, it would have been painful, but it wouldn't have been unduly painful. But because we have grabbed more and more debt and brought that future spending into the present, to let it crash now is super painful. It would be incredibly painful. And so because we have continued on this road, this downward slope of always borrowing more from the future and pulling it into the now in ever increasing amounts, it looks to be, to most people in America, so painful that they'd rather just not see it. They'd rather just not hear it. They'd rather avoid it at all costs. And so they will do just about anything to avoid facing the ugly truth. So this year we borrowed $5 trillion in 6 months, and our national debt went from 23 trillion to 28 trillion. Okay? So we were running $1 trillion deficits. We were overspending by $1 trillion before COVID hit, and we then made that 5 times greater. All right? So the fix is to let it crash and return to reality and let the markets clear and let supply and demand function. But that would be such a dislocation because things are so out of joint now. To snap them back into place is so painful, people don't want to do it. Okay? So the people, through the government, refuse to do this because it will be painful. So my prediction is we will continue to overspend. We overspent by 5 trillion this year. We will probably overspend by 7 trillion next year, and then 10 trillion, and then 15 trillion. And at some point, we will not be able to do that anymore. So that the people now will say, well, you're never going to pay that back. And I'm not going to give you money now for something I'm never going to get back in the future. So the debt spigot is going to be turned off. Or the other option is that the United States government can simply turn on the money machines even faster and faster and faster and just keep printing money, which will result in a hyperinflation. Okay? So that's what I mean by we will spend money until we can't. Either the world will say, no more debts available, you're cut off, or we will then not even listen to that reality and print money to the moon, to infinity, and we'll face a hyperinflation. Okay? So that all sounds very doom and gloomy. Well, it is, and it's always at some point. Okay? When asked about this type of thing, the great economist John Maynard Keynes said, hey, don't worry about it. And people said, yeah, but in the long run, this isn't going to work. And he came back with and said, yeah, but in the long run, we'll all be dead. Okay? So you can see the philosophical statement there. This will be a problem. I agree with you that it will be a problem. But as Keynes said, we'll be dead before it's our problem. So what they did is, this is a moral choice, for lack of a better word to put it. They simply said, we will borrow money from the future, and we will enjoy the fruits of that money today. And when our lives are gone, the future generations can deal with it. It's now their problem. So what has happened is we've been playing musical chairs with this, hoping that it doesn't land on any generation that the current people are in. They borrow money more from the future and hope that it's pushing it out there. Somewhere it'll be a problem, but not my problem. And that's been the philosophy for about 2 generations, and because it hasn't collapsed, it's not a problem. Okay? So, what you're going to find is that this type of thinking and this type of action is almost exactly like a drug user. A drug user starts using drugs and they get hooked on them. But they say, hey, it's not a problem because I'm still functioning, I still got my job, I'm still making things happen in life, and so I can control this. And then when family crisis happens, their job disappears, they lose their home, they're still desperate for that drug and they'll do anything for it, because what they're trying to avoid is the pain of stopping. See, if the fix is to let this crash and return to reality, the fix for a drug user is to stop doing drugs. But when you come off that high, you will crash and return to reality. And because we don't want to deal with reality as a drug user, the solution to coming down off the high is to take another hit. Just keep using and using and using. Same thing with our monetary system currently, is that our government's solution to this problem of not letting it come down and fix and face reality is just keep printing money. But like a drug user, to get that high to stay the same, you have to use ever-increasing amounts of drugs. And just like with our federal government spending, in order to get that same GDP each year, you have to use ever-increasing amounts of debt. Okay? So it is no fluke that an amazing number of drug users have occurred in the United States and the Western world at the same time as we have had an amazing amount of debt. Because it is the same thought process, it is the same function, it goes forward in the same way. Okay, so if we were to stop going into debt, if we were to stop spending money above what we take in, many, many things would suffer that we think are normal, but are only normal because they have been perpetuated by ever-increasing amounts of debt. Okay? And what John Maynard Keynes called this back in the 30s, when he wrote his books about this, he called this a liquidity trap. He thought of money as water. And as long as it's always flowing in the pipes of your economy, then you have a functioning economy. He said that the problem is that once you go into too much debt and you go over that threshold, you enter into a liquidity trap, meaning that there must be more and more water or money pumped into the pipes in order to keep the flow going. So, what we're facing right now is a classic liquidity trap described by John Maynard Keynes, one of the greatest economists in regards to macroeconomics. He understood these systems in ways that we're only just beginning to, and he defined them originally. So he's like kind of the father of modern macro, okay? And so as he described it there, we're facing a situation where we need ever increasing amounts of liquidity to avoid the pain of having to pay back our debts. Imagine if you had a credit card with $1,000 on it and you couldn't pay it, so you took another credit card and borrowed $1,100 so you could live at your same lifestyle, but now you're in debt $1,100 on another credit card. So you take out a third credit card and you borrow $1,500, one to pay off the first, pay off the second, and then to live your life on the 500, and then the 1,000. And now you're 1,500 in debt, and this just snowballs and snowballs and snowballs. That's a liquidity trap. And so the way it ends for these countries is at some point, 2021, 2025, 2030, whenever you want to find, that it just collapses. People lose faith in it. They stop using it, or it gets printed to the moon and you have hyperinflation. Those are the three ways liquidity traps end. No country has ever tried, hey, let's stop this. That no country has ever tried, let's detox. No one has ever voluntarily done that. So they've waited until reality came in and forced them to change. And usually that happens with, civil war, world war, countrywide collapse, something like that. Okay, so will Americans have the fortitude to buckle down and say, look, we're just not going to spend more than we make because we got to clean up this mess? Or will we just go until, reality forces us to stop because we can't? So that's the big scary elephant in the room, the big broad issue with overspending. It's the same at your individual level. If you continually overspend, pretty soon you're in bankruptcy and then you have all kinds of pain and problems. It's no different with a country. It just takes longer. Okay? So that's the big issue we face. But the simple thing is, if the government spends money, GDP goes up. It's very simple. But the underlying issues are what we really need to be concerned with. Okay? So I'll see you in class.